The ink had barely dried on the fancy documents the U.S. and so many other countries had signed that brought the new United Nations into existence. And the U.S. military was already violating all of those Geneva Conventions in its war on the people of Korea that began in 1950. This war that American history books often call the Forgotten War could never be forgotten for the generations of Korean lives destroyed by America's genocidal war against the northern half of the Korean peninsula, which saw the destruction of industry, homes, dams, and the deaths of millions of civilians. The American war on Korea was also the most violent chapter in the long series of confrontations between the U.S. and China, involving the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers beneath American bombs.
50 years ago today, we stood in rubble. The sun rose each morning through the smoke. Your planes flew above us looking for something left to bomb. Our factories, our schools lied ravaged and broke. Now you wonder why there is this anger, as we remember all too clearly a time that we once knew, when every home, every dam, and so many, many people were flattened to the ground by the things you had to do, when Korea was just another name for bombs falling from the sky, and home was just another word for this place where people die. "50 years ago today, you killed my mother. I've lived my whole life and never knew the love she might have given, the joy she might have felt to sit in the garden where her grandchildren grew. And now you wonder why we might feel attacked. You wonder at the stand our leaders take. But it was you, I remember, who gave us this lesson of the sound of a city when it breaks, when Korea was just another name for bombs falling from the sky, and home was just another word for this place where people die." "50 years ago today, you killed my father. He was shooting at your planes when he died. Just one of how many million dead soldiers fighting and falling side by side. Now you wonder at what you call an evil axis. You throw words that someday will explode. We remember the last time you said these things, when crater was another word for road, when Korea was just another name for bombs falling from the sky, and home was just another word for this place where people die." "50 years ago today, we stood in rubble."
Only 8 years after the U.S. and the Soviet Union were on the same side of an existential war against fascism, what they called the Cold War was the order of the day. There was nothing cold about it, though, with the U.S. and China actually being engaged in a very hot, very bloody war on the Korean peninsula. In 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed, leaving their children orphaned. They were accused of providing nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. What their adult children eventually discovered through their efforts at uncovering the truth about their parents' executions was that although Julius was indeed leaking top-secret information to the Soviet Union, Ethel was not involved, and the FBI knew this, as did the KGB. They intentionally executed an innocent woman in order to try to get her husband to talk. Throughout
the Second World War, the Allies managed to unite in a broad front against fascism. But once they won this fight, the ruling class convened with McCarthy in the lead to make sure the people got in line, to be sure they all took heed, to make sure they understood our new enemies were not the Japanese or Germans, but the Russians and Chinese, and all those who supported them, the enemy within, such as all the communists and any of their kin. So says the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg. So says the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg. There was a war on in Korea, untold thousands dead. One side USA, on the other side the Reds. The Russians got the bomb, there must be someone to blame, and their siblings and their spouses must be in on the game. Against one man they had evidence, but nothing on his wife. They'd arrest her anyway, and threaten to take her life, to try to make her husband snitch on someone up the chain, to instill the fear of the committee's terroristic reign. So says the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg. So says the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg. Watch out for your neighbors, be careful who you know, or you might be called to testify. You might have to go in front of the committee, where it will be assumed you're guilty as charged by every juror in the room. You can join the blacklist or watch out for what you say. Beware of who you talk to, or you might also see the day when you're called to Congress to be questioned by the ones with the power to decide if you should be taken from your sons. So says the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg. So says the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg. So says the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg.
After being essentially a colony of the United States for the first half of the 20th century, renowned for its casinos and sex workers as well as widespread poverty, in 1959, the Cuban people liberated themselves in a successful armed revolution against Batista's U.S.-backed dictatorship, with the able assistance of some folks from outside the island, such as Che Guevara of Argentina. The revolution had barely happened before the bipartisan U.S. efforts to strangle it, along with Cuban society generally, began. Cuba lost its biggest trading partner just to the north and was sanctioned by many other U.S.-aligned countries in the Americas, though not by either Mexico or Canada. Under such pressure from the United States, which also meant trading with any other country that traded with the U.S. was very difficult and expensive for both Cuba and whatever country was trying to trade with Cuba, it's especially amazing that revolutionary Cuba continued to exist as such. The Soviet Union is generally credited with keeping Cuba going after the U.S. embargo was imposed, but this is only part of the explanation. To see that this is the case, one needs look no further than the way Cuban society rose to the occasion when the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Soviet support with it. With no more oil and fertilizer coming from Russia, Cuba soon became a world leader in organic agriculture.
When we look at history and how it's all unwound, there are few people on this planet that have been more tightly bound with the liberation of our troubled human race than the man from Santiago with the beard upon his face, dressed in green fatigues that he wore most of his years, as he led his country longer than any of his peers. And few men have been vilified more often in the news than Comandante Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz. Born into a country of dengue and despair, ruled by foreign armies. Ever since Columbus got there, he'd reject his privilege and join humanity, forced to choose between his species and his family. And when legal means had failed to stop the suffering he saw, he decided it was high time to work outside the law. He organized the revolution with the rifle and the fuse. Comandante Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz. When you win a revolution, you might stop when you're ahead. But in the Havana Declaration, the revolutionaries said, wherever people anywhere are found to be oppressed, as long as we have hearts that beat within our chests, it is our duty to support them. And Cuba sent their troops, and Cuba sent their doctors in ever larger groups, and their leader was the one in the tracksuit and running shoes, Comandante Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz. It could have been someone else, and he might be the first to say, the movement makes the leader, not the other way. But around the world right now, sitting at their dinner plates, there are people praising this man who stood up to the United States and lived life as a beacon for a new society, with housing, healthcare, education, and the human right to dignity central to the vision for which he stood accused. Comandante Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz. I can't predict the future, but if the past is any indication, many more will follow the trail of the little Cuban nation. And soon in Havana, I hope that we may see a statue of the man to go beside Jose Marti. But wherefore goes Havana or Angola, Mozambique? I'll always remember the big man's rosy cheeks. If the world could vote for a leader, how many just might choose? Comandante Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz. Comandante Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz.
From my vantage point, John F. Kennedy's brief tenure as President of the United States is very challenging to characterize. He may have pushed back against the militarist status quo enough to get himself assassinated, but mostly he governed as an imperial head of a superpower in an existential competition with another superpower, engaging very deeply in the arms race, the space race, and every other kind of race with the Russians. In the U.S.'s ongoing global and very bloody efforts to contain the Soviet Union and its supposedly hegemonic plans for the world, there was an ongoing effort to surround the USSR with nuclear missile bases. Eventually, these missiles would largely be submarine-based, but in 1962, the U.S. brought nuclear missiles to Turkey to be based there, ready to launch at Russia from just on the other side of the Black Sea. Soviet leadership quite sensibly decided to respond in kind by putting nuclear missiles in Cuba, just across the Straits of Florida. Soviet missiles were already in Cuba, unbeknownst to anyone in the U.S. government at the time, when the Kennedy administration ordered the imposition of a naval blockade. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev announced at the United Nations for a global television audience that if Soviet ships were prevented from moving in international waters and attacked, they would respond. Khrushchev was making clear, in other words, that a naval blockade is an act of war and would be responded to as such. World War III was basically imminent, and there were enough Soviet missiles already in Cuba to kill everyone in the southern half of the United States if they were all launched. Although they were under orders to retaliate, when the Soviet submarine, under the command of Vasily Arkhipov and other officers, came under attack by a fleet of American destroyers, Admiral Arkhipov disagreed with the other two officers on the submarine, who were advocating for immediate retaliation with nuclear missiles. Unable to reach the necessary consensus to launch nuclear missiles, they surfaced instead. Following this very close call with nuclear Armageddon, the U.S. and the USSR made a secret agreement involving the U.S. withdrawal of nuclear missiles from Turkey and the Soviets withdrawing their missiles from Cuba.
The Beach Boys were playing on the radio. The Beatles were singing Love Me Do. Lolita was playing in the cinemas. It was October 1962. Ken Kesey published One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. John Glenn orbited the Earth. Australia had just won the most gold medals at the Commonwealth Games in Perth. The boomers were just getting into high school. Dylan first sang Blowin' in the Wind. The U.S. Army had just started their war against the Viet Minh. On the day Vasily saved the world. If I Had a Hammer was in the Billboard charts, an Air Force jet crashed into the sea. The first black student had been admitted to Ole Miss University. Hewlett-Packard sold a personal computer, but it wouldn't really take off for a while. Jackie had just come back from a trip to India. Plunging necklines were the latest summer style. Algeria had just won her independence. Korea was rebuilding from the war. The Russian River had just flooded a couple of weeks before. On the day Vasily saved the world. The CIA was running Operation Mongoose, killing Cubans in their factories and streets. The U.S. was gearing up for an invasion, still smarting from the Bay of Pigs defeat. The Soviets had sent missiles to Havana to protect themselves and their Cuban friends. The U.S. Navy blockaded Cuba's harbors, and there was no telling how this thing would end. Khrushchev got on TV to make it very clear Cuba was a sovereign state, and if our ships are attacked, we will retaliate. On the day Vasily saved the world. Vice Admiral Vasily Arkhipov was standing at his post on a Soviet Navy submarine. They were on patrol in international waters, one actor in a terrifying scene. They were out of radio contact deep beneath the water when the sub began to shake and crack. The captain said, "Arm the nuclear torpedoes. We're under attack." The Americans were bombing them, but in order to respond, 3 officers had to give the go. 2 were in agreement, but for some reason, the Vice Admiral said no. On the day Vasily saved the world. On the day Vasily saved the world.
In the earlier days of capitalism, the industrial cities of England were so polluted that all the trees died, and anyone who could afford to live somewhere upwind moved. Eventually, they developed some kinds of environmental standards in countries like the UK and the US, and the kind of total environmental devastation in the name of industry that was once the norm everywhere there was capitalism became a phenomenon reserved primarily for what they called the developing world. The developing world never actually develops, however. This is how the setup works. If they developed, this would involve laws regulating the treatment of workers in the environment. That's the sort of thing developed countries do by definition. Not in the subjugated countries, where military dictatorships are kept in power in order for the foreign corporations to maximize their profits. When the Chevron Oil Corporation, which was called Texaco at the time, set up shop in Ecuador in 1964, this began decades of complete devastation of the environment there, the ruining of countless Ecuadorian lives for generations, and record profits for the oil corporation. Long after Chevron left the Ecuadorian Amazon in a state of widespread ruin, one of the attorneys representing the indigenous communities in their efforts to be compensated for their unimaginable losses, Stephen Donziger, has been disbarred and imprisoned in the state of New York as part of Chevron's ongoing efforts to evade responsibility for their crimes against humanity.
When Chevron came to Ecuador, it was Texaco back then. They did there what they did so many times again. An ocean of sludge stored in pits unlined, no stone unturned, no resources unmined. They call it the Chernobyl of the Amazon. 1,000 square miles, dead and gone. When Chevron came to Ecuador, it was a dictatorship there. What happened in the Amazon, they didn't care. As long as they made money, let the oil flow. Where the waste went, no one wanted to know. And if they did, they could be bought. And if not, they could be abducted, tortured, and shot. When Chevron came to Ecuador, the location was preferred by the oil corporation. Because they had free reign, there was no oversight, and if anyone complained, then one night they'd not be seen again. It was a torture state. This was why Chevron thought it was so great. When Chevron came to Ecuador, it was paradise on earth. They turned it into a land of stillbirth. They left behind the ruins and took all the loot. Now they're trying to silence the ones who brought the lawsuit. Why was Donziger detained? A corrupt judge knows. And where are all the billions that the company owes? When Chevron came to Ecuador. When Chevron came to Ecuador.
A very notable incident involving the United States military in international waters took place in June of 1967 off the coast of the Gaza Strip in the Mediterranean Sea in the middle of the Six-Day War, which was a war between Israel and all of its neighbors. The U.S. was not directly involved in this conflict, but there was a big spy ship off the coast anyway, said to be doing normal maneuvers, as always. Speculation is the ship witnessed atrocities being committed by Israeli soldiers, and the Israeli military was under orders to sink it. Although they received one clear indication after another that this was indeed an American ship they were bombing, the bombing continued. Wave after wave of large Israeli bombs, missiles, and machine gun fire hit the USS Liberty. They dropped napalm, caused big fires, crippled the ship, killing dozens, maiming hundreds. They didn't sink the ship, though, and eventually they stopped bombing it. There's a plaque at NSA headquarters in memory of those killed on the USS Liberty by the Israeli military. was the 8th of June, 67, in the middle of the Six-Day War. International waters off the sands of the Mediterranean shore. They were executing prisoners by a mosque in the Sinai. And that day scores of Egyptian soldiers' bodies there would lie. The IDF was trying to cover up their war crimes, and the USS Liberty saw it all in real time. So the Israeli Air Force got the orders, bombs away, when Israel attacked the USA. The pilot saw the American flag as he came down from the sky. He asked for confirmation and was told to let him fly. They dropped 1,000-pound bombs, and then what they do is drop napalm to burn down the ship along with the crew. After all that, the ship's still afloat, came the IDF's torpedo boats. All the survivors remember the day when Israel attacked the USA. When the sailors lowered escape rafts down to the water, they were met with an aerial slaughter as the IDF attacked all those trying to flee from the fires raging throughout the Liberty. A Soviet ship offered to assist as eventually the Israeli bombers would desist. Somehow the ship managed to limp into the bay when Israel attacked the USA. Sides of the ocean. President Johnson didn't want any unnecessary commotion. Just forget it ever happened. Squash the investigation. No Israelis were punished for committing any violation. They said it was an accident, a thin disguise. Everyone who witnessed believes this is a lie. It was entirely intentional. That's what they say when Israel attacked the USA. 34 Americans dead, bombed or shot, hundreds more maimed on the spot. But the big thing about which the brass was concerned were the NSA documents they wanted burned so they could classify everything. Top secret. Tell all the survivors, don't talk about it. But finally the truth has seen the light of day when Israel attacked the USA. It was the 8th of June, 67, in the middle of the Six-Day War. In March of 1968, the U.S. military committed a horrific war crime, killing almost every child, woman, and man in the village of My Lai, Vietnam. It was a total war kind of war crime that was far from unique to My Lai. My Lai was just one such incident that the world eventually managed to hear about because of the good investigative journalism of Seymour Hersh and because of the heroism of Hugh Thompson, copter crew. There were only a handful of children and elderly women still alive in the village, and they were huddled in a hut awaiting death. American soldiers were about to kill them by the time Hugh Thompson and his helicopter crew came upon the scene and ascertained what was going on. Thompson ordered his crew to aim their weapons at the GIs and stand between them and the civilians in the hut. Decades later, the government of Vietnam gave Hugh Thompson an award, welcoming him back and introducing him to the young adults who were babies when he saved them from joining the fate of the rest of the village.
Hugh Thompson was a pilot, just like many more, fighting for old glory on a far-off foreign shore. He was on a lethal mission, only one of many, following his orders to kill the enemy, to kill the enemy. flew low above the village, searching for the foe. When he saw a wounded child on the path below, he thought this to be a sure sign that the enemy was near. So he radioed for backup and more choppers did appear. More choppers did appear. The wounded, he cried out, and beware of an attack. And then the child died by a bullet through her back. And when he looked around for the culprits of the scene, it was a company of men in U.S. military green. U.S. military green. The dead were in the hundreds, strewn all around, in this place called My Lai, which once had been a town. There was a hut of huddled children, soldiers had them in their sights. Hugh decided at that moment to fight for what was right. To fight for what was right. Weapons on the GIs, and his copter crews obeyed, and stood among the children, tattered and afraid. The whole town had been murdered, but for some kids and widowed wives, and Hugh Thompson made sure that those remaining would survive. That those remaining would survive. It was a 15-minute standoff in a knee-deep sea of red, amidst the moaning of the dying and the silence of the dead. Hugh Thompson was a soldier, and he served his country well. On the day he saved the lives of a dozen kids in hell. Of a dozen kids in hell.
As the world learned about the atrocities happening in Vietnam, which were being broadcast live in color, and as more traumatized American soldiers continued to return home to the U.S. and join the anti-war movement grew in the U.S. and everywhere. The anti-war movement was itself impossible to really separate from the rest of the movements against colonialism and for life and humanity that the 1960s embodied. The scale of the anti-war movement, as well as the degree to which it was also embedded within other movements represented by names such as the Black Panther Party or the American Indian Movement or Students for Democratic Society, would be hard to overstate. There was an anti-war coffeehouse outside of every U.S. military base, not just serving coffee in the culture of the anti-war movement, but recruiting for it as well, and actively helping soldiers leave the military. The anti-war movement was characterized not just by coffeehouses and festivals and marches, but by civil disobedience of all kinds and student strikes that shut down every campus in the country.
Everyone should know it happened half century ago all across this sprawling nation, the rising of a generation that started slow, then gained speed. Nobody knew where it would lead. First there were marches, then there were more, way too many to keep score. They shut down classes, couldn't learn. Once they ascertained how napalm burned, they had to find out how to defy. People stood up because they couldn't stand by. There were parades held by the military brass. There were cities filled with CS gas. Real wars, war games, recruitment centers up in flames. It made a match, then in a flash, draft cards turned to ash. Thousands moved across the border, refusing military orders. Every army base in the USA had an anti-war cafe. There are times when you just can't comply. People stood up because they couldn't stand by. Soldiers insisted on free will, put down their guns, refused to kill. Newspapers of the underground ubiquitously could be found across the country, across the sea, throughout the ranks of the military. Take a grenade, pull out the pin. Praise be to Ho Chi Minh, another fragging every night. A war that many refused to fight. Bombs were falling, some asked why. People stood up because they couldn't stand by. The ruling classes with all their powers shook inside their ivory towers. They were brought to their knees back then. That's why we don't have the draft again. Even back then, some of them knew they had to be careful what they tried to do. Rulers who miscalculate can lose control of their ship of state. In order to govern, you need consent, and all of that just up and went. In 68 came the reply. People stood up because they couldn't stand by. People stood up because they couldn't stand by. People stood up because they couldn't stand by.
At the time that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, he and others all across the U.S. were busy organizing for what was planned to be an epic occupation of Washington, D.C. The intention was to stay there until poverty in America was the stuff of history. In the spring of 1968, a truncated version of the march did go ahead, but nothing like what King had envisioned. Martin Luther King gets misrepresented by the mainstream narrative about the history of the 1960s as a spokesperson for black people and as an advocate for the civil rights of black people, but he stood for much more than any one element of humanity. From the beginning of the efforts to build the civil rights movement that King and so many others engaged in earlier on, the emphasis was always about human rights for everyone and economic rights. The original big March on Washington in 1963 was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. King had come out forcefully and eloquently against the war in Vietnam and had thus lost his place as darling of the liberal establishment. What might have come out of the Poor People's March on Washington had King not been killed will forever be unknown.
Was the end of 67 when the meeting began, where MLK and friends began to make a plan to try to build on all the victories they'd won. He said, now it's the era of human rights begun. All across the country, people organized, and all across the country, so did the FBI, to derail and disrupt, by press and by gun, the Poor People's March on Washington. Walks were planned all across the country to head to the Capitol, stay until victory, armed with an economic Bill of Rights. Indians, Chicanos, blacks and whites, together in a struggle for a guaranteed income, for housing, for jobs. They came from California, Alabama, everywhere beneath the sun, for the Poor People's March on Washington. On Mother's Day, 1968, they'd set up camp to challenge the United States to live up to its convictions. Prosperity for all, the plan was not to leave until they saw injustice fall. To destroy this movement, the state did its very best, as the historical record abundantly attests. But what lengths they would go to make sure that they won against the Poor People's March on Washington. Whether it's related or whether it was not,
On April 4th, 68, MLK was shot. What the future might have held if he'd lived to go, unfortunately, this world will never know. Resurrection City was built on Mother's Day. A month later, mass arrested and taken away. That's what happened, it's all true. However else it's fun, it was the Poor People's March on Washington. It was the end of 67 when the meeting began, where MLK and friends began to make a plan.
Inspired by the civil rights movement in the U.S., in the British-occupied part of the island of Ireland that some call Northern Ireland and others call the occupied 6 counties, people were marching for equal rights for the second-class citizens there from the Catholic community. This peaceful movement was met by a massacre in the city of Derry and a campaign of dirty tricks and power outages engineered by state forces in order to foment violence against the Catholic or nationalist community in the occupied 6 counties. This violence against Catholic communities in Belfast in 1969 involved the torching of hundreds of homes. If not for the Irish Republican Army mobilizing to protect the neighborhood of Ardoyne with 50 hijacked buses blocking off all the streets around it, the loyalist mob violence could have been far worse.
You could say it started long ago, or keep one lifetime in your sights. People were marching for basic civil rights. The marchers were attacked. The press made wild claims. Anything that happened, Republicans were blamed. The mood that was incited, quite intentionally, all over the 6 counties in the loyalist community, was an atmosphere of hatred, the kind that burns and kills if you live in the wrong house or stand too close to the windowsill. The pogroms of 1969. With torches, pikes, and guns, neighborhoods were attacked, supported by police, if anyone dared fight back. Fight back people did, kept the loyalist mobs at bay. Far more homes would have been destroyed if not for the IRA. Defensive lines were formed as best as could be done. 50 buses hijacked and lit up in the summer sun, surrounding the burned out shells of the houses of Ardoyne, while just beyond them Orangemen sang the Battle of the Boyne. In the pogroms of 1969. Thousands fled the carnage. Hundreds of homes burned down. There was a refugee camp in Dundalk, as big as any town. The British Army invaded the north and started building walls, separating ghettos from the bog side to the falls. If you want to understand the world you live in, you have to peel back the layers and look beneath the skin. If you do that, you may find that so much of these troubles began half a century after the black and tans. In the pogroms of 1969. You could say it started long ago, or keep one lifetime in your sights. People were marching for basic civil rights.
Al Glatkowski and Clyde McKay had been involved with anti-war protests and burning draft cards, but they wanted to do more. They decided to join the Merchant Marine so that they could get into position to lead a mutiny on a ship full of bombs, which they did in March 1970. One of them lived to tell the tale. and I have the pleasure of knowing him.
Gather round, I'll tell a story about a man I know, what he did across the ocean half a century ago. Death was raining from the skies all over Vietnam. Al and Clyde decided they had to try to stop the bombs. These two young men signed up to join the merchant marine, horrified by what they heard along with what they'd seen. They began to have discussions, they found a common goal. They'd join the crew of the Columbia Eagle, and then they'd take control. The ship was full of napalm, heading across the sea to be loaded onto planes and be dropped upon the country to burn the skin off people beneath it. At the time, they vowed to break the law to prevent a greater crime. They thought they'd spend their lives in prison, or more likely they would die. But Clyde and Al agreed that at least they had to try to sail to Cambodia with all the napalm as well, where it might remain forever, the bombs that never fell. They carried out their plan, and they didn't slip. Just two guns between them, but soon they ran the ship. They brought it to neutral waters by Sihanoukville, that these bombs might never be sent to maim and kill. But that's not how it ended. The next thing that we knew, Sihanouk was overthrown. There was a military coup. Clyde McKay died in the jungle, and with so many of his peers in a California prison, Al Gladkowski spent 8 years. The ship was not off course by much more than a bit. The future of the folly, perhaps they didn't change it. But while the blood was flowing and most people spent their days maybe marching in the streets or just joining the rat race, there are those among us who can say they really tried, who did everything they possibly could to stop the fratricide. If you see a big white beard on the Central Eastern shore, he might be a mutineer who tried to stop the war. Gather round, I'll tell a story about a man I know, what he did across the ocean half a century.
On May 4th, 1970, National Guard troops opened fire on students and others protesting on the campus of Kent State University in Ohio, killing 4 and wounding many others, some maimed for life. Weeks later, troops opened fire and killed students in Mississippi. Students were in the process of shutting down campuses across the country in response to news that had spread about the Nixon administration secretly expanding their bombing campaign of Vietnam to also include Cambodia and Laos. The anti-war movement would continue to dominate the campuses and other parts of society for some time, but the precedent set by opening fire on student protesters would be a chilling one, and one that would also inspire increased militancy, for better or for worse, within the parts of the movement that weren't cowed into submission.
There were millions of bombs falling from the sky. There were children looking up before they die. There were millions of people marching in the street, hoping that their country would meet defeat. There were military contracts, lots of dollars to be made, selling heroin and fighter jets in the arms trade. There were millions of soldiers refusing to kill. There were others taking orders directly from the hill, like the ones who were sent off to turn the campus red, who were sent to kill the students dead. There were governors talking about military rule. If they want a bloodbath, let's bring one to their school. If they want a bloodbath, this was the very phrase. That's the language that the governors were using those days. That's the way they thought, and that's exactly what they did. There were politicians talking about gunning down kids. They said the students were worse than the Nazis in the war. A quote from the governor just a few days before. The guard was sent in to turn the campus red. They were sent to kill the students dead. There was a sniper on the rooftop, ready to conspire. There were the National Guardsmen with the orders to fire. They all lined up, ready, aim, shoot. There was President Nixon in a three-piece suit. He brought the war home like he said he would. There was a whole generation who understood. There were soldiers lined up 100 meters away. A bullet in the back is the price you gotta pay. When the guard is sent in to turn the campus red, sent to kill the students dead.